Hello, you're watching Context. I'm Dilek Tuna. In a recent statement, Israeli National Advisor Tzachi Hanabi named Syria and Lebanon as potential candidates for future integration into the Abraham Accords. What renders this proposition particularly intriguing is Syria's conspicuous silence in response to Israel's strikes on Iran, and abstention from even the mildest formal criticism. Today on the program, we ask, is this realignment a diplomatic possibility or pure speculation? What does silence signal in the Middle East? And could the Accords take on a radically new shape in a post-war region? So joining us to unpack are Mehmet Çelik, he's a Middle East policy expert from Istanbul, Turkey, and Caroline Coulier, she's a member of the Jewish Diplomatic Corps, part of the World Jewish Congress in Brussels. A warm welcome to you both.
Thank you, welcome.
Thank you.
Now, Caroline, prior to the most recent and dramatic phase of escalation, the Syrian government had pledged not to permit any armed groups to launch attacks into Israel from Syrian soil. So how consequential was that commitment?
I think it's hard for Syria to guarantee that no offensive will be led from their territory. They have a lot of also subgroups. What I do see is the will, at least, for a normalization. Syria has been improved military, economically for the past years. And you were mentioning the silence of Syria. I think the silence is not constant, it's cautious neutrality amid shifting alliances and some kind of exhaustion as well.
Okay. And Mehmet, what might this silence, coupled with Hanegbi's remarks, suggest about the future trajectory of Israeli-Syrian relations? And the second part is, how does this align with the evolving nature of Turkey-Israel ties?
Well, I mean, from the initial days, I think Syria has voiced that willingness to normalize its ties, and not only with Israel but with everyone, as the state is rebuilding itself. I think this is a very important political will that they want to, especially when it comes to removal of sanctions from the EU or other countries. So that positive atmosphere I think sets the tone of that normalization and the willingness for that. But of course, it comes with, as Caroline said, with cautious, willingness. And also there's conditions that will need to be in place before that normalization take place. And I'm obviously referring to the Israel's attacks on Syrian territory, the occupation or annexation of Golan Heights, and Israel's not abiding by the previous agreements when it comes to that buffer zone there. So I think if the conditions are set, Turkey right now has not made an official stance on this yet, but that normalization between Syria and Israel will be attached to some of these conditions, and Turkey's position will be determined based on that. But nevertheless, I think Turkey leaves it up to Syria to decide, despite the fact that Turkey has an influence on Syria. The normalization between Turkey and Israel, on the other hand, is something directly attached to the current conditions and the genocide taking place in Gaza.
Okay. And Caroline, could a post-12-day war landscape offer fortuitous ground for further expansion of the Abraham Accords?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the post-conflict window is often the best time for unlikely diplomatic moves. I think there's a very recent, interesting article wrote by Nathan Sharansky, which is a former Israeli politician, saying that Iran's regime is a paper tiger, weakened strategically by internal unrest, economic crisis, and weakened in the eyes of its own people. So definitely, I think there's an opportunity. Conditions of expansions, obviously, of the Abraham Accords depends on stronger U.S. diplomatic also efforts, and also I think maybe we can touch upon, but what the call for Syria and to join the Abraham Accords is a way maybe also to set us on a win from Israel and from the US, from the recent Iran and Israeli war.
Okay. And Mehmet, if Syria is indeed brought back in from the cold, more fully reintegrated into the rest of the region, could this by extension have ramifications for its relationship with the South Caucasus?
Well, of course, I mean that that normalization wave. I mean, it had started before the October 7, and I think on Turkey's side especially, that was a very successful moment. Even with Israel, Turkey was normalizing its ties. But October 7th has changed many dynamics in the region. And not only that, Israel's attacks on Syria, Lebanon, and Iran very recently has also changed some of the dynamics. Now with the ceasefire, if it holds actually, new dynamics will mean much more for states like Syria and Iraq and their regional integration. Of course, that rebuilding phase is very fragile for Syria, and their engagement in other regions, or even establishing some concrete and tangible bilateral ties with people in the region or the states in the region, is based on that sustainability of that rebuilding phase. And it is a very fragile phase right now. It is hard to speculate how this will unfold, whether it will be actually moving forward, or whether this will once again bring some sort of instability in Syria. So I think wait and see policy for both Syria and the states that want to, or regions that want to integrate Syria in their relations is right now the best policy that they can get, because there is still security concerns. There's still redevelopment phase that is still linked to many sanctions imposed on Syria. So once this is actually normal, once the security is established, the economic development actually starts kicking off, then with Iran, with the removal of Iran's influence on Syria, Syria will be in a better position to engage in different geographies and also establish better ties, and not only in the region but also beyond. I mean, South Caucasus is not a very direct region for Syria, as in the southern Middle East, but we will see how that will also be shaped given Iran's minimizing influence in the region as well.
Okay.
I do believe, though, that Anegbi's latest remark actually is actually very bold, because there are so many profound changes happening, and it's really about testing the regional and internal reactions. It's a messaging that normalization could extend even to former enemies. And I think Witkoff and Donald Trump, Witkoff said it in February, mentioning that Syria could actually maybe one day join the Abraham Accords. And Donald Trump in April, meeting with the new regime in Syria, actually said, well, once you've done the job, we will be glad to actually welcome you in the Abraham Accords. So I think these are pretty interesting stances, and especially coming from Israel, willing to open the door.
Okay.
Well, I mean, in international relations, there is no permanent enmities, as we know. As I mentioned, even with Turkey going through that normalization phase previously. So it is possible, of course, but I think for Syria's sovereignty, there are certain conditions that need to be met for that normalization to even be sustainable. Even though there is political will, I think sustainability of that normalization will mean more conditions for coming from Syria attached to this, joining Abraham Accords or even normalizing ties. But nevertheless, I think the fact that there is political willingness in place is also a positive step for the future of Syria, regardless of Israel or other states when it comes to bilateral ties.
Okay. All right, Caroline, well, what would be the strategic benefit for Israel if even informal relations with Damascus or Beirut were pursued?
Well, hopefully peace. That would be great. Normalization could lead. I think it's about also Middle East taking, its destiny in its own hand, like finalizing accords between Arabs and the Jewish state will mean also a new economic viability, new partnership opportunities on technology, resources. It will really create another counterpower, I'd say. For example, when we talk about China, Russia, or Europe, I think it will be a fantastic opportunity to develop the region.
And Mehmet, as for Lebanon, what are the implications for a country whose architecture remains partially reflective of Syrian and Iranian sensibilities?
Well, I think for Lebanon, it's a little bit more complicated given Hezbollah's presence there, and also even though it is, the operational capacity or capabilities perhaps minimized compared to the previous period, given Iran's lowering influence in the region, and also with the Israel carrying out airstrikes or even eliminating some leadership position figures from Hezbollah. So that is a different, I think, scenario. Still, that will also depend on the effect of Hezbollah on Lebanon's decision-making processes, and also some of the European countries' influence on Lebanon and how to normalize ties with Israel. I think France, for example, is one of the countries that had mediated when Israel was carrying out airstrikes and expanding its war into Lebanon. So we will see how that will unfold. I think it's a lot different than the current situation in Syria, and how Syria-Israel ties will be normalized if that takes place.
And I do believe that actually what's the interesting shift that we see in the Middle East is maybe that the former mandate, from France and Britain are actually a bit pulled out of the conversation. So the countries themselves can actually work on their benefits, on the common benefits themselves
together
in the region. And I think that could be the real paradigm shift that we can see in the Middle East.
Okay.
I think, if I may add to just what Caroline said, I think, as something that Turkey has proposed for a while now, is that the region, of course, there's disagreements and there's problems in bilateral ties between the states of this region and the people of this region. And I think bringing solutions to these problems from the region is a key to stability in the region. When there is the external actors involving in these processes, I think it further complicates the situation, and rather than bringing a solution, and I think makes that instability more permanent when the third parties are involving.
And Turkey has a great role to play. I mean, we know that the influence that Turkey is trying to have in the region could be also maybe play a mediator component part for the shift. So let's see.
Mehmet, do you agree?
Of course, Turkey's role in the region, Turkey's role in mediation in different conflicts in different parts of the world, this has brought a very strong prestige for Turkey internationally, not only in its region, but when we look at Ukraine and Russia conflict, even in conflicts in Horn of Africa between Ethiopia and Somalia, Turkey has that prestige and reliability when it comes to finding or facilitating at least a platform for mediation. So Turkey's role in the Middle East is obviously not something that we can dispute or disagree with. But nevertheless, I think one of the key barriers to this normalization in the Middle East is current genocide taking place in Gaza. And the lack of humanitarian access or humanitarian aid deliveries plays a big barrier between Turkey and Israel. And as long as that is in place, despite the fact that even on Syria, for example, Israel and Turkey have held technical talks in Azerbaijan to avoid any type of military confrontation over Syria, still there is a huge political barrier on Turkey's side to establish any form of ties right now with Syria, or to facilitate even something like Abraham Accords, Syria joining Abraham Accords at the moment.
Okay. I would have to agree with most of the things that you're saying, except for the word genocide. But it could be another conversation.
That is an entirely another area of discussion.
To state it.
Okay, we'll stick to the topic for the moment. Caroline, how does Israel view Syria's silence, compliance fatigue, or leverage?
I think it's both. I think I think it's a neutrality, but at the same time, again, because we have seen some shift in recent also political will to normalize, I think they have striked also the military, some of military and planes of Syria. I think they see that as an opportunity, and that's exactly what the minister called Syria to potentially join the Abraham Accord. And there's a reason why he's saying this now, after this 12-day war that was led against Iran, specifically uranium factories.
Okay, and Mehmet, beyond official silence, what's the sentiment on the ground, particularly among the political elite and civil society in either country?
Are you referring to Turkey or are you referring to Syria?
Well, let's say Syria, but Lebanon as well.
Okay. I think right now they're very busy to establish the very basics in Syria. Nevertheless, they don't want to be. I think one of the most important things for Syrian elite and Syrian future is to, when there is this rebuilding phase, to ensure that there is that inclusivity, to ensure that the basic needs are met, to ensure that corruption doesn't take place, and to ensure that a democratic future can be established without the influence and also the interference of third parties from the region. I mean, we know that we know what happened in the past 60 years with the influence of Russia and Iran, even in the past 15 years of this war. Nevertheless, that normalization, the people's sentiment, I think, is very skeptical when it comes to Israel. Very skeptical because of what's taking place in Gaza. And that word that Caroline disagrees with me, it's not my own terminology, it's the terminology of international legal institutions. Nevertheless, this, as you said, it's a part of a different discussion. But for the political elites in Syria, I think there is still that conditions attached to this, any type of normalization, so that that is not, buttoning the shirt with the wrong button leads to many different wrong sequences that will follow, I think, that normalization. So I think from get-go, if things are set on a very equal level, I think that skepticism will perhaps minimize.
And you said something that is very important when you want to try to normalize relationship is actually trust. Is making sure that the partners have trust, and therefore having also the right people coming in to support these efforts of trust. So Turkey can play a role, US will definitely play a role, quid also of Qatar, how they will also play an indirect or direct role. But I think trust is a key component, and this might take time.
Okay. All right. Now we're coming to a close shortly, but I've got one last question that I want to ask you both. I'm interested in both your perspectives here. Is this proposal about expanding peace or about isolating Iran? So Caroline, let's hear your answer first, and then we'll hear from Mehmet.
Why not both? I think there are different steps and different phases. I think the first phase is definitely to isolate Iran and the axis that we call the axis of Iran. I think the long term is definitely to have a region that is strong, a region that can collaborate, that can rely also on their natural resources and technology, and to get to be more independent from also Western societies. So I think that's the long-term goal, but I think it needs different types of steps, and obviously making sure that the Iran proxies have less capacity makes it easier to isolate Iran and then call the former enemies to become new friends, at least new partners.
Okay, Mehmet, and I'll ask for your answer as well. Is this proposal about expanding peace or about isolating Iran?
Well, I mean, I think isolation, the word isolation for this region comes with a lot of problems. So I think even further, I will push this further. Why not even integrate Iran? I'm saying this with all the things that Iran have done to isolate itself from the region and the region's countries, be it through proxies, be it through that some moves that have damaged trust. But Iran, if it is willing to negotiate, let's say over the nuclear deal, I think it should be given that room and that chance to diplomacy rather than attacking, for example. Nevertheless, I think isolation brings its own problems with it. but it should be, the more focus should be on integration and peace, and that expansion of peace will benefit everybody in the region. But I think there is some foundational problems right now in the region, and the humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Gaza. I think we cannot talk about any of these other developments to not to be affected by that crisis taking place there. So I'm not trying to, attach everything to the Gaza situation there, but I think the region's countries' relationship and that trust relationship with Israel will depend largely on what is, especially on Turkey. I mean, I can basically talk about Turkey, will depend a lot on what is taking place there right now. Nevertheless, Iran, for the Arab world or for Turkey, for Israel, mean different things. And isolating Iran for Turkey, for example, it is not something that is sustainable. Rather than that, I think bringing solutions to the problems that Iran poses to the region should be discussed on different platforms through diplomatic means.
But I agree also that the region has a role to play in building Gaza. So which country also will step in? I think having also Arab countries taking responsibility to help this region of the world to have a chance, that would be fantastic to see. So maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe someone else. But I think they definitely have a role to play. I think in a way it's a bit tight also to what will happen there.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much to both of you, Caroline and Mehmet. I appreciate your contribution to the program.
Thank you.
Now, the Abraham Accords reshaped parts of the Middle East, but their next chapter may be the most complex yet. Bringing Syria or Lebanon into the fold would mean rewriting decades of hostility, reshuffling alliances, and reimagining what normalization even looks like in a post-conflict region. For now, Syria and Lebanon remain silent, but in the Middle East, even silence speaks volumes. That's all from us tonight on Context. Until next time, thanks for watching.